the first time you see these large language models, you just think, this is magic. There's something going on here that's incredibly complex, and it must be tons of hard-coded rules that have gone into this. And actually, the complete opposite is true. It's a beautifully elegant solution, which is that all they are doing is they are trained to predict the next word in a sequence of words. That's it. Or more specifically, as a sequence of tokens, where you can divide a word up into lots of sort of 2 or 3 letter tokens. And so when you think about that, that's remarkable, isn't it? That you can sort of model human existence by predicting a sequence of tokens, this thing that we call language. And I think it speaks to a sort of deeper truth about why we use language and why language is so important and flexible, and that it really genuinely is able to capture so much of what we call reality.
Hi everyone, it's Lauren Hawker-Zaffer. Welcome back to Redefining AI, the Tech Podcast. I'm an educator and I'm taking you on an educational exploration. Now, today's journey follows the paths of generative deep learning, teaching machines to paint, write, compose, and play. To explore this topic, I've been joined by David Foster. Now, many of you may be asking, who is David Foster? So David is the co-founder of Applied Data Science Partners, a data science consultancy delivering bespoke solutions for clients. He holds an MA in mathematics from Trinity College in Cambridge and an MSc in operational research from the University of Warwick. He is a faculty member of the Machine Learning Institute and has won several international machine learning competitions. Now, David, he's also the author of Generative Deep Learning, teaching machines to paint, write, compose, and play with the publisher O'Reilly. This is an acclaimed technical textbook that focused on novel applications of deep learning to generative modelling. So it's time to explore. I'm going to welcome David into the conversation. Welcome, David. It's great to have you join me today on Redefining AI.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for that introduction, and pleasure to be here.
How are you today?
Yeah, very well. I'm constantly trying to keep up with the ever-evolving landscape of generative AI with the book writing, but it's an exciting time for sure.
What's your thoughts about the ever-evolving landscape? How are you feeling? It's become quite mainstream. There's a lot of narratives flying about, circling around what is generative AI, how's it used? What's your own thoughts? How are you feeling?
There are. I think every company and person is trying to find for themselves what they believe it to be and what it can do for them. And I think we're right at the start of this journey. It's a really exciting journey, I think, because for the first time, we're sort of seeing AI and machine learning more deeply in the public eye, I think, than it's ever been, with the likes of ChatGPT, all of the text-to-image models as well, so DALL-E 2, for example. And I think it's just going to continue throughout 2023, particularly really creating value for people and companies. I can't wait to see what comes out next. It's just getting faster and faster. We seem to be on an exponential curve at the moment of progress.
And what's your gut feeling towards that? I mean, before we go into the depths of what we're tackling here today, generative modelling, I think that one word that you've mentioned that is quite ever present is the fact that it is mainstream. What's your gut inclination when something like this does become mainstream?
Well, if I had to sort of summarize it, I think it goes beyond the sort of typical face value stuff that you can do with generative AI. Obviously, you can do it. You can use it to generate some text. You can use it to generate images. And I think that's the initial kind of low-hanging fruit that people are using it for. They're using ChatGPT to get ideas or recommendations for something or complete a paragraph that they've started writing and so on and so forth. But I think the longer-term play of all of this is almost like a web of interconnected generative AI models that talk to each other, get things done in the real world, and really form sort of like an undercurrent to human activity. And I think, this might take years to develop, but I think it's what we're already starting to see with the likes of the plugins from ChatGPT. You can now, use ChatGPT to do things on the web and to interact with other third-party tools. And so it's moving away from just text and text to image, and it's becoming something that's actually, assistant-like in the real world. It really is the beginning, I think, of the human augmented world that we've all sort of been talking about for a long while, where humans are augmented by AI rather than AI being this separate sort of entity that we kind of dip into when we want. I think it will just become an ever-present force in everything that we do. And that's, our personal lives as well as our, work and commercial applications as well.
Fascinating analogy. I mean, I like the analogy of the whole web of interconnected generative AI models. And you've emphasized that it might become, or it will become, an undercurrent of human activity. So we can see, David, that generative AI or generative modeling is one of the hottest topics in AI at present, seen as we outlined in the introduction as well, with accrediting your book. It's now possible to teach a machine to excel at human endeavors, such as painting, writing, and composing music. So the question I think that we might want to start with is, how did we get to this point? I mean, to the point that we're talking about and that you're writing about generative deep learning and how to teach machines to paint, to write, to compose and play. I mean, deep learning was an advancement in itself, but now we're talking about the generative capabilities. Can you expand, bring us into this journey as to how we've got to this point?
Yeah, definitely. The timeline of generative AI really goes back as far as any sort of machine learning. It's something that humans, I guess, have always wanted to be able to achieve. And if you go back far enough, you can find people looking to build generative AI models in the 70s, 80s, and so on. What I think has happened recently is there's been a spark in this particular area because of three things. I think firstly, there's been a realization that the data that's being collected on the internet is actually an amazing resource for training models. And crucially, generative AI doesn't necessarily rely on a labeled data set. It's a form of sort of semi-supervised learning or unsupervised learning in some cases, where it's simply looking to model patterns in the data for its own sake and therefore generate new content as a result of understanding those underlying representations. So because of this huge amount of data, we now have the ability to train models on effectively the whole of human knowledge and human existence. And that brings me to the second point, which is that we've got the computational hardware to be able to deliver on that now with the GPU revolution, if you like, that has happened recently. And then I think the third sort of pillar that's really unlocked all of this generative AI stuff is model architectures. There's been a lot of really critical developments in things like transformers, diffusion models. Transformers were 2017, diffusion models was 2020. And we're talking 5-6 years that these things have been out maximum. And many of the techniques are even more current than that. And so, these three pillars have really made the generative AI landscape much more rich and diverse than it ever has been. And I think companies are realizing now they can take, and institutions like OpenAI, DeepMind, Meta, they can build these large language models because all of the jigsaw pieces have fallen into place all of a sudden. And there's massive amounts of value it's like an untapped mine that's, never been found before. It just hasn't been reachable. But now there is, and everyone's diving in to get hold of the diamonds, if you like, that are lying beneath.
You're sort of saying if we didn't have the internet with the large connection of data that's now publicly accessible from certain components of the internet, the computational hardware, the GPU processing units, and the model architecture like transformers, then we wouldn't be at this stage.
That's exactly right. And I think more than that, actually, if you look at, why is it that we've got so good at language modeling? Well, it's because there's a lot of language data available. Why is it we've got so good at image modeling? There's a ton of image data available on the internet. Why are we not so good at video modeling at the moment? Well, it's a more difficult task, but also, video data only started to really proliferate through the web more recently than image data. So there's just less of it. And also there's other modalities as well, like music, perhaps, that aren't quite as easily accessible, certainly in a way that, you can train models on without sort of infringing copyright, and I'm sure we'll come to that later. But it's interesting to see the modalities that we've started with are the ones where we've got the huge corpus of data. And I think, you can sort of see language as a shadow of human existence, if you like. It casts our reality in this very simplistic stream of token data, which we call words. And it seems that is good enough in many cases to capture reality in such a sufficient way that it seems to have reasoning abilities. It seems to be able to really understand what it's doing, but obviously still make very simple mistakes. And I think an interesting area where I think we might see development in future is generative models that are trained on actual kind of real world experience. And by that, I mean sort of embedding them into robots. And you're seeing this with things like Palm E that has come out recently, and other models. I know Jan LeCun, for example, talks about his JEPA architectures, which are all of this idea that they are predictive models that predict slightly into the future of where you are, much like a human generative model might do. So I think, they're the sort of reasons why I think we've started with, language and images, but it's only going to evolve into other modalities over time.
And where will those predictive capabilities come from? Does that fall back in maybe the intrinsic or the unique nature of the generative deep learning models? I mean, you mentioned like the semi-supervised, the unsupervised techniques that are used, like the machine learning model techniques. Is it because of that? I mean, I'm not a machine learning expert myself. Can you maybe give us an insight into where those predictive capabilities are coming from?
Yeah, the first time you see these large language models, you just think, this is magic. There's something going on here that's incredibly complex, and it must be tons of hard-coded rules that have gone into this. And actually, the complete opposite is true. It's a beautifully elegant solution, which is that all they are doing is they are trained to predict the next word in a sequence of words. That's it. Or more specifically, as a sequence of tokens, where you can divide a word up into lots of sort of 2 or 3 letter tokens. And so when you think about that, that's remarkable, isn't it? That you can sort of model human existence by predicting a sequence of tokens, this thing that we call language. And I think it speaks to a sort of deeper truth about why we use language and why language is so important and flexible, and that it really genuinely is able to capture so much of what we call, reality. And I think it really shouldn't be possible, this stuff. It's if you sort of said to somebody, right, what we're going to do is we're going to train these models to just predict the next word, you kind of think, well, they'll get to a certain point, but they won't be able to capture long-term structure. They won't be able to really reason. They won't really be able to form anything more than, a very sort of superficial output that maybe captures some of the statistical properties of the text, but doesn't really, do anything more than that. But what we're seeing is that it is able to do this just by predicting the next word. And it's not perfect. And there's people who kind of pick out the fact that it's not perfect and point to the fact that means that it's, it's never going to be the answer to things like artificial general intelligence. And I certainly have sympathy with that. But I think it's also not a problem to be amazed by this technology and constantly absolutely baffled by how impressive it can be just by predicting the next word. So I think that's sort of how I'd summarize it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And you've also now written a couple of books, David. So you've got Generative Deep Learning, Teaching Machines to Paint, Write, Compose and Play. And that's out in April 2023. Mm-hmm. What did your first book focus on? And why did you then continue with the second? Was there any external factors that you monitored and contributed to these particular efforts?
Yeah.
And what do you want to motion with your books?
Yeah, the first edition of the book came out in 2019, and I'd started writing it a year before that. I remember thinking I wanted to write a book about something I thought was going to, change the world. I didn't want to just write something, a generalist machine learning book at the time that, there's a lot of great textbooks out there on that subject. And so I was thinking, this generative deep learning stuff was really niche at the time. It was fairly under the radar. In 2018, we're sort of talking about transformers just coming in, GPT just coming in, the early GPT models. But already you could see that there was something different going on here. This wasn't the usual supervised learning where you need a huge sort of labeled training set and you're doing one task. But there was something special about this technology that really got me excited at the time. That sort of started me on the journey of learning about this because, at the time, I don't think anyone really could call themselves a generative modeling AI expert, apart from those who had been doing it for, years in academia, because it just wasn't something that you did in industry, really. There'd be no need to generate pictures of the back of somebody's eye. You'd rather know if that picture had a glaucoma or something. So it was all the other way around. It was all discriminative modeling. It was all about predicting something about the image rather than generating the image itself. Anyway, so, that sort of started the journey. And the second edition, when I started writing, I realized so much has changed that I've basically got to write large chunks of the book completely from scratch because the modeling techniques have changed. The way that you approach problems has changed, the architectures, data sets, and so on and so forth. So it does feel like a new book, the second edition. It's, 80% new content, I would say. And I'm proud of it because I think it does summarize for a beginner, what is generative AI and how do you get started with it? And it covers all of the different areas: transformers, diffusion models, GANs, VAEs, energy-based models, normalizing flows. There's all of the kind of main techniques are covered. And I feel like even though the field is progressing very fast, the fundamental ideas in the book won't fundamentally change over time. And it's a good grounding for anyone looking to get started. So what do you feel was the trigger that changed the approach to how people were looking at the problems then? I mean, you mentioned the discriminative modeling. That was the way it was looked at rather than a generative modeling approach. Mm-hmm. And you highlighted the change
in the outlook on certain problems. What motion that change?
Well, I think if you look at the early days of generative AI, and I'm talking the modern era, so maybe from 2014 onwards when GANs were invented, they were impressive for what they could do, but they still weren't to the point where you could be a human would be fooled by a GAN generated output versus a real photo. You could generate a picture of somebody's face using a GAN, but you could still tell as a human that it was computer generated, and that doesn't take away from the fact that it was impressive at the time. But, I think there needs to be a certain threshold before this sort of technology becomes really useful. Something that you could imagine anyone, member of the public using or a company using. So it was almost like an academic set of curiosa that people were sort of studying as these interesting objects, like GANs that could generate images and LSTMs that could generate text. But, ultimately, they couldn't really be applied in the real world. And I think what started to change with the advent of transformers for text and now diffusion models, but also things like StyleGAN for images, is that the threshold has been crossed, that we can be fooled. And this started with the whole deepfake thing. I would say 2018, 2019, I think that was when it started to sort of really be talked about. And that has sparked a lot of research in academia, but also in industry. And I think companies are now getting wise to the fact that this is a technology they need to adopt. There's no way that I think companies can operate without integrating this kind of technology into their processes, because it will be everywhere very soon. And so I'd say that's the real reason, is that it's, generative AI has become useful, really, really useful. And I think that's only going to become more apparent, this year and next.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that analysis. And I do think that it is certainly a technology that organizations do need to adopt. We've looked at from various different perspectives and analysis recently that there is the huge potential of expanding the runway of opportunities to organizations' top lines. I mean, we've spoken about as well in Forefront Aids that there is the frequent usage of generative AI in applications to maybe create images, to create art, using it in design, to produce text. How do you then think that it might transform industries such as healthcare, finance, transportation, if we're to look at that from a more minute angle?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's some aspects where it's going to transform every industry in the same way. So, for example, if you think about the number of times in the day where you have to generate text for something, it's on the order of hundreds of times a day. And I think every single touch point there is a potential for generative AI to take an impact. So that will differ obviously across industry. But for most people, I think they'll see these tools starting to, and they already are, come into things like the Microsoft tech stack, email, being built into more kind of chat interfaces as well. So if you have a problem with what you're doing, you won't sort of Google it necessarily. You might ask a sort of chat interface that's connected to your data. So it might be your company SharePoint or something, or the body of information that represents your company will be absorbed, and you could query it directly, but through a human language interface. And we're already seeing, companies like Google rolling out Bard for the chat interface sort of way of searching, and we'll see more and more of that. In terms of individual sectors and industries, I know, for example, healthcare, it's been talked about for a long while and has seen real advancements in the field of drug discovery and generative AI's applications there. But also, the idea that you can, in other industries, solve problems not by training a model to do one thing, which is the old and, in many cases, actually useful way of doing it now. But you could take a large language model and just talk to it about the problem and try to use it as almost like another person in the room. Because it's, whilst, it's never going to get everything right, it's got the entirety, if you like, of the human existence behind it to base its opinion on. And I think that'll be a really interesting advancement, is this idea that you can go to the generative AI models for help about something. And I think that's just it unlocks so much of potential within all of us. It doesn't replace us. I think it just augments us. I think that's really exciting.
It certainly opens up lots of new avenues. And I do agree with the whole forefront of the ability to integrate a chat interface and open up new avenues to how you explore information and how you search for information. And it's something that I found my own behavior is starting to change, that I'll look on ChatGPT and I'll maybe interact with it much more frequently than maybe accessing older search engines. So my own habits are starting to change. One thing that I want to question on that is, if you look at the interaction patterns and the conversational dialogue that's happening between you and the interface, it doesn't give you a personal opinion, which you don't expect. But sometimes when you're prompting it for a response, then you'll use natural language that indicates that you might want an opinion.
Mm-hmm.
What's your own opinion about it having opinions?
Yeah. So the alignment problem with generative AI is probably the central problem, I would say. The technical aspect of it is largely solved. We found that, modeling tokens is a great way to embed reasoning and meaning into models. But what hasn't been solved is, like, what do we want these models to do? Because it really does matter, not just what you train it on, but how you prompt it as to the kind of response that it gives you. We've already seen good examples of this in reality, where you can jailbreak some of the models by providing a prompt that tells it to ignore previous instructions. You can make it be very, very left-wing, very right-wing. You can really sort of guide it to what you want it to be. And you're right that at the moment, the machine that everybody sees out of the box is identical for every single person. And the challenge will be making that baseline version as neutral, but not neutral in a kind of like bland way, but neutral in a nuanced and balanced and a way that it can see both sides and is kind of the perfect view of reality that we would love everybody to have a good understanding of everyone's opinions, but still present kind of a balanced view of the world, because there is no one model that's going to satisfy everyone, that's for sure. And I think what we'll start to see is that maybe different countries will have different rolled out versions of, say, a large language model that adhere to the rules and laws of that country. Maybe individuals will have personalized language models that are tailored to their style of thinking and their way of ingesting information. And I think that will all just become part of this, I kind of want to use the word metaverse of large language models, because it feels like that's what we're building here. The traditional view of that metaverse is that the humans go into the AI generated world and we make the transition. But I think what we're seeing is that the AI models are coming the other way, and that, we're going to be embodying this physical real world, but alongside lots of different AI models that we're able to interact with. So I think part of the issue is going to be solving this ongoing problem of alignment, which certainly hasn't been solved already. We're only going to do this by having a dialogue and talking about this openly, about what we want them to be and what we want them to do.
Yeah, and I definitely think that is the component of exploration that still offers a lot of interesting angles to really uncover, because we're looking at maybe the limitations, but it's also a realignment and looking at how we can make it more advanced, more sophisticated. And I do think that there's an ideal opportunity to look at sort of rebalancing biases from those two perspectives. Like also from the engineering of how the large language module is structured, what it is providing as responses, but also the biases that we bring in interacting with the chat interface and with the model itself.
Yeah, completely. I bet you, if you looked at the logs of ChatGPT, you'd get a pretty good understanding of human existence, what people are asking and what their motivations are. And yeah, it must be a really interesting training set, or data set, I should say.
So let's maybe touch upon one thing that's also become of ever more importance when we're talking about the access to generative AI and also the usage in everyday existence and how people are using it. So we know that the use of generative deep learning, it impacts our understanding as well of authorship and creativity in the arts, like music and literature. If generative AI were able to create a work of art that was indistinguishable, let's say, from a human created work, and we spoke about that, being able to distinguish, is it a generated image or is it an actual human created work? Would it be fair then to consider the AI system as an artist in its own right? And how might this as well, David, challenge our traditional notions of creativity and authorship?
It's a huge question. I think honestly, the this will be an ongoing topic of debate, long after 2023, 2024. I don't think there's a one solution answer to this. What I would say is, first of all, we've had technology for a long time that has changed the face of art and design. I mean, you've only got to look at something like the camera. When that technology, especially the digital camera, which was in the hands of everybody, when that technology came in, that was at the time also meant to be the death of painting, art, the ability to create a representation of something that was more accurate than any artist could produce. So therefore, why would we need painters? And, art has never been as exciting, and it leads to a huge influx of new ways of interpreting what art means. And I think, as someone, I'm interested in, art and music myself. And I just think art is a reflection of our current time. And then I think that also involves the technology. It's not in competition with it. Whole new branches of the field have sprung up as a result of the technological advancements of the age. And you look back to, the Renaissance onwards, and you can say that is true from any point in art history, that technology drives art and art helps to also drive technology in many ways. So I don't see the two as in competition with each other. And on the topic of assignment of ownership, whether the AI model is the owner, or whether it's the person who trained the model, or is it the person who put the prompt in? I would say, I don't think there's one answer to that. If you had to push me, I would be on the side of the fence of, the person who is using the tool is the one who ultimately has the creative ownership of the output. I don't really like the idea that we should be assigning ownership to AI models in the same way that we don't assign ownership to Photoshop or Grammarly if we're using a text, we're writing a book. I just think, AI is one tool in the arsenal of humans, and it's a phenomenally powerful tool, but it doesn't really sit well with me that we should be sort of saying, well done, GPT-3 for writing this block of text. Somebody ultimately has to be using the tool. I think actually maybe that speaks to a sort of deeper truth about these models, which is that they don't really have any agency of their own. There's no will to what they're doing. It's just they are responding at the moment to our prompts. So, the GPT-3 or GPT-4 models aren't sitting down and thinking to themselves, well, I'll write myself something today. They've got no reason to do that. So therefore, they certainly shouldn't have ownership, because there's no will in what they've produced. It's a tool that's being used in the same way as a spell checker at the moment, just a very, very good one. And then, I think, just to answer your last point there on where this is going forward, I think the ongoing topic will be more around things like copyright and attribution. I think that's really important that we get this right, because, as I say, the two shouldn't be in competition with each other. We must find a way to rightfully attribute work where attribution is needed, but also not put the shackles on these incredible technologies, because they will help art and they will help creativity to develop beyond anything we can imagine at the moment. And we shouldn't really try to constrain that too much, but we must do it in a ethical and fair way, I would say.
It reminded me for a second of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. I don't know why, but it popped up in my head, like the whole ownership discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly. It's you're right. It's a monster that is a reflection of its owner in many ways. And I think that's certainly true of these large language models as well. There's a huge amount of power in the hands of the creators, I would say, at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Which also leads me on to children that are growing up with AI at the moment. I mean, you mentioned that you feel that there is the open opportunity to blossom creativity, for it to develop far beyond what it has at the moment. What do you think it means for children then that are growing up, that are increasingly exposed to AI and that being part of their everyday existence?
This is it's an area that's really close to my heart, because I'm a child of my own, but also I used to be a teacher, and I understand the challenges of the classroom environment and the pressure that technology puts on the education sector continuously to keep up, if you like, with what children are seeing. We saw it with the internet and the rollout of, first of all, internet, libraries in schools, and now devices in the classroom. Should you allow people to use mobile phones? That is the source of, so much information in the world. So, where do you strike the balance? And this is just going to be another one of those cases, I think. Just to take it at a sort of face value level, do you allow a student to use Chat GPT to write their essay? Now, that question there is as deep as, back in the day when we were asking, how should the internet be used by children? Isn't it unfair if some children have access to the internet at home and others don't? How do we test for plagiarism, for example? And I think there's so many questions that spring up out of this. Firstly, what are we testing? What do we want children to learn? Do we want them to learn to think on their own, or do we want them to use the tools in order to come up with a general structure of how to structure their thoughts and then, use that as a kind of grounding for their own ideas and opinions? Do we want to use these tools as education assistants in their own right? So if you have a problem and you don't understand, why something is true in a, say geography or physical geography, whether you should be able to ask the AI models and how do you know that they're going to give you back an accurate and true response? Because we obviously have, there's deep problems at the moment in LLMs when it comes to truthful responses. They have a tendency to hallucinate. And then you've also got, there's issues around, we're trying to move away from things like timed tests and exams because it's not reflective of the real world. So we move into coursework, which is more reflective of how we operate. We go away and we have time to solve a task, and we draw information from different resources and we present it back as the best of our abilities. But the problem with that now is that, if you give people access to ChatGPT and other large language models, then how do you know you're not just seeing a completely ripped copy of something that's come off of that, and the child has put no thought of it into that essay? And I don't think there's, again, any answers to this at the moment. I just hope that people in positions of power, policymakers, senior people in the education sector, are deeply considering these problems, because there's going to be a tidal wave of usage, basically, of these tools over the next few years. And I don't know what it means for the education sector, especially when there's imbalance in access. That's the problem. If you've got some children who know how to use these tools, they're being taught how to use prompts, they have access to it in their classroom, against those who don't, then you're just going to widen the gap. My personal opinion is I think there's a brilliant chance here to really level the playing field and to give everyone access to incredible educational resources. One model can do so much good for so many children, I think. But again, only if it's used in a responsible and ethical way, and there are firm guidelines as to usage. Because we don't want children growing up not thinking for themselves. It's the joy of existence, is to come up with your own ideas and to play and to experiment with your own beliefs. And we don't want it all just to come from AI models. I'm really sort of passionate about that. But how we do that is an open question.
Yeah, there's so many ambiguous pieces of that puzzle, and you've certainly highlighted several of them. There are already several concerns that the development of AI, it's outpacing regulation, and that, that children may be exposed to AI systems that are not adequately tested or regulated. There's also the other component, the other piece of the puzzle that you mentioned about the whole beauty of being able to challenge yourself cognitively and to also reach the cognitive capabilities and extension, reach levels of capacity that are much higher than just understanding, that are remembering, lower levels of cognition and cognitive challenging. I also think that an important point that you mentioned is, the computer biases, of being expectant that everything that comes from a computer is correct when you don't know it's necessarily correct. So there's so many components that are intertwined into a main concern that you raised is obviously that we want to ensure that there's safety and that unintended consequences are obviously minimized to ensure that there is accessibility, but also safe usage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, safe usage is certainly an ongoing, and it's not just in education. I guess it's across every usage of these kind of models. And I think certainly in education, I think what will end up happening, what we'll see, is that there will be a greater component of real world participation in testing. And what I mean by that is, back in the past, you might be able to submit your coursework and you do a few essays in time conditions, and then that's your mark. But in the real world, we're constantly being asked to interact with others. We have to present our ideas in an influential, convincing way. We have to be able to speak well in front of other people. We have to be able to really sort of work collaboratively across teams. And then for teams of people to work collaboratively, we have to understand hierarchy within those teams. And those softer skills are often missing, I think, from our current education system. We don't necessarily reward people that have those abilities. And I think that's why sometimes you see people who, they struggle with the traditional education system because they're not good at essay writing, and they, under exam conditions, find the pressure too much to kind of handle, and they don't cope well with that. But they are fantastically successful in life. And that's because they have other skills that aren't necessarily rewarded. And I think we've got an opportunity with these tools to, AI tools like large language models, to level the playing field, particularly for people like that, where, they can be rewarded now, not just for the quality of their essay writing, but ultimately, if they are able to present the ideas back in that essay in a presentation, or in a way that, they have to convince other people in the room of their ideas, they have to then internalize what that essay is all about and be able to present it, on the spot or as part of a debate or something along those lines. And that's just opening a new dimension to what we mean by education, I think. Rather than just those words on that one bit of paper being marked by one person, and moderated, and that's your mark for that essay. There's so much more to the ideas in that essay than just the words on that page. Why not present it? Why not, compare it with other members in your class? And if there are different ideas in those essays, then part of the mark should be about how well you can back them up and how well you can, really convince other people, but in a way that's collaborative, communicative. We've got the opportunity here to do something amazing, and we shouldn't just say, well, education's ruined because of GPT-4.
No, not at all. And I really hope as well that we can open new dimensions, and I'm sure that we will. It's been wonderful to have you, David, on Redefining AI. You've certainly given us a plethora of thoughts that we can explore, and I'm sure that our listeners agree. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed the chat. So I'll look forward to listening to all of the other episodes. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank everyone else for listening today. If you'd like to find out more about machine learning, search and emerging tech, then access the Squirrel Academy on learn.squirrel.com. Thank you.